I want to welcome you to module number 2. This week we are going to explore both leaders, both President Lincoln as well as President Jefferson Davis. We're going to talk about the war going west, particularly Grant's victories out west, and then we're going to look at guerrilla warfare. And I want to clarify something that I told you last week that's incorrect. I mentioned last time that your final exam would be the writing of the battle analysis paper. You will have to do the battle analysis paper as a project assignment, but you're also going to be required to complete a final exam. So apologize for the confusion, and you can see that in the syllabus. Okay, so although both presidents, interestingly, were both from Kentucky, they had very different leadership styles. And we're going to start off with briefly talking about Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln was the 16th president in an unbroken line of succession of U.S. presidents, while Jefferson Davis earns the distinction of being the first, really the one and only, president of the Confederate States of America. We would say USA for the United States of America. Well, it's CSA for the Confederate States of America. Lincoln never served in the Army. However, in 1832, during the Black Hawk War, he did serve in the Illinois militia. So Lincoln never saw combat. Davis was a West Point graduate and a Mexican War veteran with considerable military experience under his belt. What defined Lincoln as a leader was his adaptability. I would say that was his defining trait, adaptability. And you can see this with how he dealt with the generals that he encountered, the troublesome generals that continually frustrated him, as well as his decision to wait to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. And while Lincoln did not initiate it, he was one of the more prolifically photographed presidents in the 19th century. A student of West Point, Jefferson Davis was heavily influenced by the writings of a French military theorist who was required reading at West Point. The man's name was Antoine-Henri Jomini. In fact, the majority of military tactical manuals at West Point came directly from a French influence, thanks to the mystique surrounding Napoleon Bonaparte. And like most men who were schooled at West Point, Davis employed an offensive-defensive strategy when it came to war. And although he never quite articulated exactly what that strategy meant, we can see the Confederacy employing this throughout the war. Once he became president of the Confederacy, Davis was adamant about not having war cut into or ruin the southern states. Instead, he repeatedly made statements about taking the war north out of our territory. And as the war progressed, Davis's strategy evolved. First, he emphasized a defensive strategy after the Battle of Fort Sumter in an effort to defend each state of the Confederacy. Conducting counterattacks was an element of offense to Davis because he saw it as a means of maintaining the support of the wealthy white Southerners throughout the war. And of course, once the war began, Davis had to adjust his strategy. After the first Battle of Bull Run, he authorized an offensive into the Southwest to continue Confederate expansion westward. So despite their differences, Davis did share some commonalities with Abraham Lincoln. Both presidents visited battlefields. Both regularly met with their generals. Davis, in fact, often called Robert E. Lee back to Richmond to talk with him. Lincoln both visited generals' headquarters, and he directed generals to visit him in Washington. Unlike Davis, who made several trips out west, Lincoln never went west. Also, both presidents had to wrestle with public opinion, just like presidents do today. Both would have to weigh professional concerns of their military commanders against the pressure to do something in the eyes of the public. Both presidents would find themselves at odds with their commanders throughout the war, resulting in firing them at times. And both presidents eventually found their superstar general. Of course, Lincoln with Grant and Davis with Robert E. Lee. Now, after the Union defeat at the first Battle of Bull Run, first Battle of Manassas, Lincoln was concerned with how things could have turned out had the Confederates marched all the way to Washington. And this frightened him, this unnerved Lincoln. And The man that was commanding the Union troops during the First Battle of Bull Run was Irving McDowell. And he proved incapable of doing what Lincoln wanted him to do, so he replaced him with someone who had a stellar reputation for his performance in Western Virginia. He was a young officer named General George Brinton McClellan. Like so many other generals of the Civil War, McClellan was a West Point grad. He finished he graduated second in the class of 1846. He also, like Jefferson Davis and Ulysses S. Grant and so many other Civil War generals, McClellan also served during the Mexican War. But in that war, he wasn't an infantryman. He served as an engineer, and so he had a talent for construction and bridge building, and that was very important during that time in history. Now, upon McClellan's promotion as commander of the Army of the Potomac, and then eventually general-in-chief, he set about to reform the Union Army. He instilled proper drill and training. He standardized the various hodgepodge of uniforms. If you take a look at MacDonald's book on Great Battles of the Civil War and you look at the Battle of Manassas, you'll see that there's a really great color illustrations that MacDonald included that show you the different types of uniforms that the Union Army wore during that battle. Well, McClellan standardized that and basically had everybody wearing Union blue. And we can even see a French influence in that with the blue uniform. He also instilled a spirit of what we would call esprit de corps in his men, which is basically a sense of camaraderie. And because of all these reforms, McClellan was nicknamed Little Mac after Napoleon. McClellan's first big test as general-in-chief came with the Battle of Ball's Bluff in the closing months of 1861. It's noteworthy to mention that naming Civil War battles depended upon which side named it. The Confederates tended to name Civil War battles for nearby towns, villages, or man-made landmarks, while the Union Army tended to name battles for geographic features, bodies of water, and so forth. For example, the Battle of Sharpsburg was named for a village. That's what the South would call it, while the North would have referred to that battle as the Battle of Antietam, because of the Antietam Creek that flowed nearby. Now, after the debacle at Bull Run, General McClellan was promoted to General-in-Chief, and he ordered General Charles Stone to send a scouting party across the Potomac River to find Confederate troops who it was reported that they had occupied a position a few hundred yards beyond the top of a 100-foot bluff. With their backs to the river, the Union troops mounted an ill-fated attack and were forced back down the bluff and into the Potomac River, where many of them drowned or had to surrender to Confederate troops. So while the Battle of Ball's Bluff did little to change the course of the war or the outcome of the war, it did change the political tone. Like McClellan, General Stone was a pro-slavery Democrat in Union blue, and we would call somebody like that today a RINO, R-I-N-O, which stands for Republican in name only. And in the wake of two Union defeats, radical Republicans in Congress took action and established what was called the Joint Committee on the Conduct of the War. Stone was arrested after the battle, and without charges, I might add, and released a few months later, but he never held a position of leadership again. And so from the time of late 1861 until the end of the war, every Union general in the Eastern Theater would have to wage war under the scrutiny of this congressional watchdog group. And under pressure to counter two Union defeats within 3 months, Lincoln pressed McClellan for action. McClellan proved to be a total disappointment to Lincoln. Not only did McClellan regularly disrespect President Lincoln, he continually complained to Washington and justified his inaction against the Confederates by over-exaggerating their numerical strength. As 1861 ended, the Confederacy had handed the Union a string of defeats, proving that they were the superior fighting force. Frustrated, Lincoln orders General Order No. 1, which basically mandated that all Union armies were to move forward by Washington's birthday, February the 22nd, 1862. General McClellan fired back with a 22-page letter stating why he couldn't advance. Lincoln, frustrated, looked out west for more promising news. And one Union army that had made significant gains was in the Western Theater and was commanded by Ulysses S. Grant. By this time in the war, Lincoln had began to get a real grasp on the nature of the conflict presented before him. And as a result, he developed a four-pronged concept strategy for the war. Strategy number one was total defeat of the Confederacy. Nothing else would do. Number two, to wage unlimited war across both theaters. Number three, to attack the Army of Northern Virginia whenever the Union Army could. And number four, to take advantage of the superior manpower as well as the industrial capacity of the North. Now in the Western Theater, as we mentioned last week, the Western Theater differed from the Eastern Theater in a lot of ways, not just because of the dividing Appalachian Mountains, but the Western Theater there was more spacious land out west as compared to the Eastern Theater with its heavy forests. The population density was lower out west because it hadn't been settled yet. The food was also more limited out west. And also, Western operations were conducted on smaller scales than in the East. Also, Lincoln recognized that the Mississippi River was the key to the West. Basically, whichever side controlled the Mississippi River controlled the West. So the Union began eyeing the Tennessee and Cumberland rivers, both of which neared the Kentucky-Tennessee border. The Confederates built 2 forts to guard each of these vital rivers. But the most significant difference lay in the method employed out west, which was steam-driven riverine warfare, as opposed to the Napoleonic-style clashes of infantry in the Eastern Theater. So I want to pause and have us ponder the amount of attention the Eastern Theater gets in Civil War narratives. And it does. It reminds me of the treatment afforded on the Western Front of World War I. Most books about World War I are going to contain major battles that were fought on the Western Front. But let's not forget that there was an Eastern Front in World War I, but we don't hear a lot about the Battle of Tannenberg and so forth and so on. Same thing happens in the Civil War. And I think part of the answer to this can be found in what's called the drama of battle. The dramatic elements surrounding things like Little Round Top at Gettysburg, the Sunken Road at Antietam, Burnside's Bridge at Manassas not only command respect, they are easily visited and gazed upon by historians and tourists alike. You can go and see the bridge. You can go and see Little Round Top. And so I think that's part of it, the dramatic effect of the battles, the drama of battle. While no one can argue that the war was actually won in the West, it does not get the emphasis that the East does. And there's a couple reasons for this. After the war, most white Southerners tended to celebrate the achievements of Robert E. Lee, his generals, notably Stonewall Jackson, Jeb Stuart, and the Army of Northern Virginia. Gets a lot of press. Much has been written about how Virginians took over the Southern Historical Society papers in the 1870s and fostered a very Virginia-centric account of the war. Another reason concerns the historiography that was produced in the mid-20th century. An author by the name of Douglas Southall Freeman wrote a 7-volume set on General Lee and his army. Bruce Catton chose to celebrate the Army of the Potomac in his 3-volume set. And then Shelby Foote also romanticizes the Eastern Theater in his 3-volume classic on the Civil War. In the end, the attraction of the Eastern Theater, then as now, is due to a combination of its dramatic elements, the location of the opposing capitals, they were only about 100 miles apart, the proximity of the Eastern Theater to the northeastern press, as well as Europe, the importance of the East economically and politically, and traditional conceptions of warfare. The decisive battle that prevailed then and continues to attract folks today. Now, Fort Henry on the Tennessee River and Fort Donelson on the Cumberland, both forts were just a few miles apart, and Union forces planned to use a mixture of steamships, ironclads and gunboats to take those forts from Confederate hands. On February the 6th, 1862, General Ulysses S. Grant was given permission by General Henry Halleck to attack both forts. Grant chose Fort Henry as his first target. Now, Ulysses S. Grant was from Point Pleasant, Ohio. He was a skilled horseman. He adored horses. He was also a veteran of West Point and the Mexican War. And after the Mexican War, General Grant returned to his family business of tanning leather in Galena, Illinois. Grant was a very humble man. He hated the spotlight, was well beloved by his men, just like Robert E. Lee. Both men had much in common and were a likely match for one another later on in the war. During his tenure in the war, and even during his presidential terms, Grant was maligned in the press often by his colleagues and accused of being a drunkard. And there's not a whole lot of evidence, frankly, to support these claims. However, Grant never swore. He rarely lost his temper. About the only story that exists where he did lose his temper was when he saw a soldier whipping a mule in the face. Grant got off his horse, marched over to the man, grabbed the whip from him, and then shook his fist in the man's face and said, "You infernal villain." Now, that's about the extent of Grant's foul language, if you will, and his temper. On February the 3rd, 1861, Grant loaded his 17,000-man army aboard a series of steamboat transports and set out from Cairo, Illinois, along the Ohio River towards a landing spot on the banks of the Tennessee River near Fort Henry. And after disembarking his troops, Grant gave orders for an attack on the 6th of February at 10 o'clock in the morning. Unfortunately, Union troops got bogged down in the mud, and they were unable to attack at 10 o'clock. Cooperating with Grant, 4 of the Union Navy's newest ironclads, led by Andrew Foote, were able to attack at 10 a.m. and quickly captured Fort Henry. And although the Battle of Fort Henry had cost less than 120 casualties on both sides, it was a major turning point in the war because it opened the way in the West for the Union to basically patrol up and down the Tennessee River at will, from northern Mississippi to Alabama. The Confederacy never really recovered from this setback. Now, during the shelling of Fort Henry, most Confederate troops fled. They left and went to Fort Donelson, about 12 miles away to the east. Grant pursued them overland, and while the Union Navy sailed its ironclads back up the Tennessee River, turned right at the Ohio, and then turned back down to the Cumberland to Fort Donelson. Donelson to join Grant's troops. Now, Fort Donelson was not going to be as easy a victory as Fort Henry was. Confederate General Albert Sidney Johnston made sure he had plenty of troops within Fort Donelson to repel the Union attack. In fact, the forces were evenly matched, about 17,000. Commanding Donelson were Generals John Floyd, Gideon Pillow, and Simon Buckner. And on February the 15th, Union soldiers and gunboats began the attack. The Confederate cannons were situated, as you can see from this photograph, situated high enough above the water line that they were basically able to fire down on the Union gunboats, putting many of them out of action. Grant sent his infantry in to capture the fort. And by this time, Floyd and Pillow had left the fort, leaving Simon Buckner basically alone to negotiate surrender terms to Grant. And now Grant was very firm and basically stated this, quote, "No terms except unconditional and immediate surrender can be accepted," end quote. And so this earns Grant the nickname of Unconditional Surrender Grant. His initials were U.S. anyway. And so from this time forward, a lot of folks called him Unconditional Surrender Grant because of this policy. The capture of both Confederate forts was the bright spot that the Union needed, and Grant chose the west bank of the Tennessee River to make his camp at a place called Pittsburgh's Landing. General Halleck had ordered Union General Don Carlos Buell to reinforce Grant before advancing into the interior of Tennessee. Also with Grant was General William Tecumseh Sherman, stationed at nearby Shiloh Church. Now, unbeknownst to Grant, Confederate General Albert Sidney Johnston had about 40,000 rebel troops hiding in the nearby woods, ready to attack Union forces once they settled down to camp and before Buell could arrive. So on the morning of April the 6th, 1862, Union pickets, basically forward listening posts, picked up the sounds of advancing rebel troops as they made their way through the woods. And before most Union soldiers could even get dressed, Confederate troops sprang out of the woods, yelling their famous rebel yell and basically terrifying most of the inexperienced Union soldiers, who many fled in fear, but many stayed and fought. The bullets were flying around so much that the soldiers nicknamed the area the Hornet's Nest. General Albert Sidney Johnston unfortunately was killed during the Battle of Shiloh, and Buell's reinforcements finally arrived to push the Confederates back. Now, the Battle of Shiloh was also a turning point in the war, because in just 2 days of combat, the Union had suffered 13,000 casualties, and the Confederacy suffered 10,000. Most Americans fell at Shiloh than had fallen in all previous American wars combined. The fact that Grant's men had been unprepared to meet that Confederate assault and suffered so many casualties led to charges of incompetence on Grant and whispers about his drinking, and a demand for his immediate removal as commander of the District of Southern Missouri. General Henry Halleck arrived and took personal command of all Union armies, placing Grant second in command. After the Battle of Shiloh, Grant began to launch a series of attacks against Confederate forces from Tennessee into Mississippi. And Grant knew that the city of Vicksburg, Mississippi, was the major obstacle that stood in the path to complete Union dominance of the Mississippi River. Remember, as we mentioned a minute ago, whoever controlled the Mississippi controlled the Western Theater. So taking Vicksburg would involve a crippling blow, would deal a crippling blow to the South. And Grant devised a plan that would involve crossing the Mississippi River south of Vicksburg, where the terrain favored the infantry. Now, to get his Union forces across the mighty Mississippi, Grant would need several gunboat transports to sail through a gauntlet of Confederate artillery batteries. And on the night of April the 16th, 1863, the first wave of Union vessels ran the gauntlet of Vicksburg's batteries, losing only one ship. To conceal his true intentions, General Grant left Sherman opposite Vicksburg to capture Jackson, Mississippi, and had Union cavalry sweep in from Memphis to disrupt and confuse Confederate General John Pemberton. As Grant waited for Sherman to join him, he decided to move directly on Vicksburg and laid siege to the city. After 46 days of digging trenches and tossing handmade grenades, Confederate forces under Pemberton surrendered on July the 4th, 1863. We're going to stop there, pause for a moment, and we'll pick it up with guerrilla warfare here in just a moment.